This is a reading of Chapter 15, Customers. It's a reading from Billy-Bubba's Dumbass Texas Muffler Shop. Chapter 15, Customers. At a meeting of business owners over pizza, one of the guys was relating a crazy customer story, complaining in the hopeless way people do when they rant at the government. Another guy put it in final form, in a nutshell. If you didn't want to deal with the public, you should have never gone into retail. Well, that pretty much says it all. To say we encountered crazy people from time to time is an understatement. It's like a civilian talking to a war veteran. The veteran looks into the face of the civilian, then realizes there's no way, absolutely no way, he can impart the information of the battle, the horror, the elation, the excitement, the experience. It's like trying to explain the concepts of yellow, blue, and red to a guy who has been blind since birth. The veterans were included in their own subgroup of crazies. A bush vet comes up to the counter. A bush vet is a guy left over from the Vietnam War, sort of like a guy stuck in the 60s. A large VA hospital caters to and enables these guys. The guy is wearing a t-shirt with a map of Vietnam printed on it, and he has a beret with all sorts of pins and badges. A military tattoo is on his forearm. I want to include a preliminary. They do not spend money. They have money, but are reluctant to part with it. Most we saw were on some kind of VA benefit program, say 30% disabled or some such. All of them were medicated, pills to burn, excess pills to sell, to augment the 30% disabled stipend. Hey, do y'all have a discount for Vietnam vets? It was, as a form of greeting, ingenious. A salesman, a guy who really knows sales, has got to acknowledge that. Says hello, identifies his need, establishes first move in the chess game, takes a position, puts you on the defensive, requires you to respond. He really got the ball rolling with only a single sentence. Jose never had time for these guys, most of whom were time wasters, and he would not treat the encounter with any kind of viability, even if he were slow or even currently doing nothing at all. "Oh, sir," he commiserated, "I am sorry. That sale, the Vietnam Veteran Sale, finished Sunday. We now have a sale going for Gulf War vets." I would ask him if he did not have sympathy for these guys. They'd gotten a raw deal coming home in more or less defeat to an unappreciative public. Their watchword was they didn't get their parade like the World War II vets did. They felt betrayed by the U.S., being referred to as baby killers and such. Many of them took to drink and drugs and never got on with their lives. "Well, Bob, let me ask you, did the Wehrmacht guys go home to Germany to parades? They came home in full defeat, to complete disgrace, and were tagged as real baby killers. They got on with their lives, rebuilt Germany with no fanfare, no whining, no VA, or self-pity. How about Japan? Same thing. Those two countries were destroyed, and the veterans quietly returned to society." Jose, too, had been in the army. He left school at age 14, as was not too uncommon in Europe. When old enough, he did a stint in the Spanish army, living at home with his mother and commuting daily to his army job on a Vespa. But the army had in fact killed him, it turns out. He had gotten sick in '62, a sore throat, bad tonsils, infected adenoids. But there was a new miraculous treatment also used in those days in the U.S. A doctor would lay an instrument in the throat and nostrils for a few minutes. It looked like a Q-tip impregnated with radium. The small amount of radioactive material was devastating to the infection, but left no lasting visible injury to the patient. Within only one day, the sore throat was completely gone. Unfortunately, 20 or 30 years later, almost every single one of the people who underwent such treatment got leukemia. For a time, we had a bird lady. "Hey, man, I can't drive that car in." My guy firmly shook his head and indicated the car still out in the lot. The lady sat in our waiting room cooing pleasantries to her little bird, which she kept wrapped in a little towel. I walked out with him and looked in. The entire car, except where the driver sat, was flocked with randomly dispersed bird shit. It was a dried white fluff of deposit, evenly patterned with lost feathers. The entire dash, the passenger seat, console, entire back seat, and the flat area in front of the rear window. I shrugged and smiled. "Ho, seat area is clean mostly." I carefully got in and drove it the 4 feet forward to situate it on the 4-post lift so we could work on it. I was bigger than her, and very little of the dried white stuff had gotten onto my blue Dickies work shirt. What did I was able to brush off as a white powder. Man, that took years and years to deposit. Once a customer came in while Jose was there, and he gave me his "I told you so" look as I dealt with the encounter. The guy's wife was in the back seat, and she stayed in the car when he came up to the counter to inquire. We had to bring in the car, and it was an ironclad safety rule never to bring in a car with a person or pet in the car. Sir, would you please ask your wife to wait in here while we looked at your car?" He had a very sing-song accent, sort of nasal, but he was insistent.
"She must remain in the vehicle."
"Well, for safety. That's why we ask. In case of an accident, the car might fall off the lift if the lift should fail. Also, it's quite hot out in the garage at the height of a car in the air. It is not air-conditioned out there, and it's about 100 degrees on the ground, but in the air it's maybe 140.
"She must remain in the car. She is menstruating and is unclean."
I stood my ground and insisted. We hurried the job, and I billed him out, and they left. After they were gone, Jose opened the front door, spilling the AC, and commented, "You should have listened to him, Bob. You should have asked him to remain in the car with her." The heat was a killer, no doubt, and that 140-degree figure is no exaggeration. People were always asking to leave their pets in the car, and I always had to insist, and of course this forced them to hold the pet by leash outside the waiting room instead of coming inside with their pet. Of course I always relented if the pet was cutesy-wootsy, a kitty or a puppy or a chickie. But I had a zoo of 8-foot pythons, ferrets, descended skunks, pit bulls, tailless Manx cats, hairy-eared lynxes, emu chicks in cages, goats, lambs, and an old horse. Once during a hot summer day, we evaluated a guy's car while it was in the air, sold him the job, he okayed the job, told us he was going to go to Long John Silver's for lunch, and we began work. Mid-job, we hear a meow, and looked around the shop, shrugged, and went back to work. We heard the meow again, looked at each other, and realized, oh, hell, it's in the car. We rolled the equipment away from under the car, disengaged the locks, and lowered the vehicle. I opened the driver's door and looked in the front seat. The car was black and had deeply tinted windows. I saw nothing, reached around and pulled the rear door lock and opened the rear door. There, in the back seat, a baby seat with a toddler, little face, bathed in sweat. He was swaddled in baby attire, a full insulated jumpsuit, more appropriate for snow, complete with little hat with 2 dangling drawstrings. His bottle was empty, too. Oh, Christ, get him out and into the office under the AC vent. My hands fumbled the plastic Fisher-Price latch and could not make it retract. It was stuck, and when I pressed the button, it would not let me pull the 2 halves apart. I reached under the car seat to find the actual seat belt. It was covered by a couple baby blankets, and I was ripping ineffectually away at it when I heard, "Hey, what you doing with my kid?" There, returned from leisurely enjoyed air-conditioned lunch, toothpick in mouth, was the kid's ever so concerned dad. "Dude, your kid's about half dead. We called an ambulance and Children Protective Services. You got a couple minutes to say goodbye to your kid before they take him away from your sorry dumbass forever." He backed up silently, one hand on the toothpick. My hands were shaking and my voice was shaking, and I went into the bathroom, and I was no good for the rest of the day. We had customers who came in repeatedly but who never bought anything. And this is where the computer helped me, because my memory's not that good. We had a field for customer notes and another field for vehicle notes. I went to the trouble of making a $0 invoice for my own records for every single car that came into the shop, even if the customer did not buy anything. Most other shops, heck, none of the other shops went to this trouble. So when a certain lady customer visited the shop repeatedly, each time in a different car, I began to notice a pattern. She has brought in a whopping 5 different cars and never bought anything. Each time she was curious about the details of what was wrong, more so than an average lady. Obviously, she was the wife of a guy who owned a used car lot, and he was using us to get a free diagnosis, then fixing it himself. Would you like us to fix it for you today, ma'am? Take about an hour, and it'll be $47.68, which includes tax. That's out the door. What's wrong with it? Oil sender unit? I did not lie, but I cringed giving away this hard-fought info. She said she would think about it and left. Next time in, she had another car. Same thing. My guy wanted to fix her wagon. He wanted to throw her a curve, a misdiagnosis. Well, what you going to do when she comes back mad? Eventually, having put on the part you recommended and then finding out that did not fix the problem, then they're going to be mad. I put up a sign. Free estimates if work done. Diagnosis only, $25 minimum. My guy countered with a company rule. We got a free estimate advertisement. Don't you got to give 'em free? Only on certain services, not everything. The sign was just this one lady, and for similar such customers. I never used it for anyone else. Of course the estimates are free. They're free whether the person decides to do the job here or not. He may want to check prices elsewhere first. He may only have a little money to cover a small job, but not a large sum. He may have a budget and have a predetermined maximum, and he may not even like the look of my shop, may have second thoughts, he may not trust the diagnosis, but the free estimate is predicated on the assumption that he might buy from me, even if he and I reach a mutually beneficial agreement. I want to know whether he does not wish to buy. It is a gauge for measuring my effectiveness. Each transaction keeps me on my toes, keeps me honest, keeps me hardworking and grateful to have work, and keeps me from growing complacent. She came in with her 9th car, and I asked after the complaint. As I took the keys, she said, "The fan blows, but it won't cool." I pointed at the new sign and asked, "You want an estimate, ma'am, or a diagnosis?" "We have a used car place, and Jim, my husband, does most of the work himself. We always come here for a diagnosis, though, 'cause you guys are always right and don't give us any grief. We wondered why you didn't charge to tell us what was wrong." She smiled. "I'm glad to pay the $25. Preachers sometimes ask for free, calling it a love offering for the church. You might think this happened, but rarely. However, there is a small industry of part-time preachers in Houston, each trying for tax-free status for his home. Some of them are very sincere, but many are just scamming the many taxmen who plunder our society. Our own paid spokesman, a former prize fighter, got himself arrested in the small town where I had one of my shops. He was passing out tracts in a no-tract zone or something. One of the cops bragged about hands so big the handcuffs hardly fit. As such, it was a symbolic arrest to go on record, proving that this witnessing for Christ really did prove the validity of the massive tax write-off. I always came back at such a request with a reasonable compromise. We can go tax-free if you fill out a tax form. I had a whole book of collected forms in a 3-ring binder from people claiming tax-free status. All they had to do is fill out a blank form and sign it. Point-of-sale software defaults to add tax to parts, but with a click, you do a tax override. Once at Jose's shop, they took in an immaculate Yugo for exhaust. Now, a Yugo is very unusual in that its exhaust pipe is only 1 inch, the smallest I've ever seen. The smallest pipe we had normally was 1.5 inches. They had lifted it up to examine the work to be performed. The guy working there doing that happened to have a back problem, slowly developing his posture so that he bent way over. He did not have to lift up the car so much for examination. It was lower than normal. Dwayne happened to let fly an irrelevant observation. "I hear these things are death traps." The owner, the preacher, exploded in anger. He demanded Jose fire Dwayne on the spot. But Jose did not take the bait. The preacher had tried to turn the slight against his car into a discount. Jose Riley knew how to butter ecclesiastical bread and merely held firm to his 10% discount. "Well, I'm going to pray about it," declared the preacher. "Pray fast, sir. We have other customers waiting." He must have not prayed hard enough, for Dwayne was killed in such a car a few years later, broadsided at an intersection. The Yugo is a case in point about cars, international politics, and economics and unions. The Yugo came from the now defunct Yugoslavia. It and the Subaru were both brought in by the legendary Malcolm Bricklin. He took a big chance both times, but struck success, almost pure gold, with the Subaru. All Subarus are all-wheel drive. Not some of them, all of them. And when you go to places like Alaska, there are a great many of them, for they are reliable and cheap. Bricklin found a legal loophole in weight requirements. The first few he brought in were classified as motorcycles at a much lower import duty, not because they had two wheels, but because they weighed less than the stated required amount for a car that our tax code called for. He had been poised to bring in another groundbreaking car, the Cherry, from mainland China. He had already set up a deal with Walmart to sell them, probably at a very low price. I can conceive of a $3,000 car with greatly reduced paperwork flow for purchase. Can you see it? The wife says, "I'll go get the groceries. You go buy the CD and a new red car, and I'll meet you at the door." He picks the color, zips his credit card, one line for the CD, the second for the car. With the collapse of Detroit, this will now never happen. It would break the union and the whole industry, so forget it. When I lived in Germany sometime, about 1965 or so, my dad had a headlight go out on his used 190 Mercedes. He went to a parts place and asked for a headlight, and they came back with a teeny halogen bulb, and at first he thought they had brought him the wrong part because he was expecting a big honker American-style sealed beam. To his delight, the teeny halogen bulb did the trick and was as bright as a solar flare. When he related the story to his German co-workers, they shook their heads, for the dumb American had been ripped off on the price, having paid a whole mark, about a quarter. By contrast, Congress, listening to the lobbyists and unions, had kept halogen bulbs out of the U.S. for a couple decades. Ka-ching! Even Consumer Union magazine was against the advent of the halogen bulb. They railed against the halogen bulb and beat that sealed beam drum long after people knew they were on the take. They also railed against the Subaru. I maintain a minor hobby finding errors in Consumer magazine at Kroger while my wife shops. Once they said not to buy a Sony cassette recorder I owned because it would not record in stereo, just play it. So I mailed them a tape of a recording I made explaining their mistake, but they never replied. They were wrong on that one. I also owned a laptop they reviewed whose word processor they said could not vary the indent, but it did. They once promoted mobile homes. A couple months ago, they described the Chevy Aveo with the oh-so-neutral adjective of chintzy. Save me from the regulators. There was one year when Ford Explorer took it very hard. They were renowned for inadvertent rollovers. At the same time, nearly every other feature of the car seemed to scream failure. But 1 year later, they were voted as best car of the year. A turnaround that quick on all fronts just cannot be true. It has to be political. An enraged customer stomps in and slaps a Midas invoice down on the counter in front of me. "My wife and I had brakes done here a couple months ago, and 'cause they was locking up, I pulled the wheels, and them calipers is on upside fucking down." I let out a "oh Lord" in commiseration and asked for his keys so we could correct our fuck-up. I tossed the keys to a grinning employee. I'm passing a humorous hot potato of good cheer, something to lighten our day. Before the wheels are even off, the customer, still in the dark, blurts out, "That's a sumbitch right there who done it." He points at the employee with the air gun, unzipping the lug nuts. In a few minutes he comes in, grinning, nodding. Upside down, about 10 minutes, bleeding flush. Pads are new. I'll check the rears too. "Well, what you gonna do?" he asks in an accusing manner. He had just heard we were going to fix it, so he must have meant what restitution I planned to give, perhaps full or partial refund, perhaps fire the employee. Let him fix it first, and then I'll bring him in here so you can hear. I'm using the old information on his Midas invoice to make him a new note charge, one of our franchise invoices, explaining what we are doing. I also use my scanner to make a copy of the Midas receipt for my records. After 10 minutes, we hear the air gun zip up the lug nuts, then the bleed and flush, just a touch-up really, finally a test drive, a couple loops around the lot. My guy sheepishly brings in the keys and hands them to me. Now that's an important point. An experienced tech hands the keys only to the boss, never to the customer. He never knows if the customer is paid yet, and it does happen that a customer occasionally drives off without paying. An experienced tech knows this, and also knows a good extended prank like the one in which he is about to participate. "Joe," I begin, "you are fired, pal. Pack up your tools and clear out." He looks surprised and hurt and plaintively asks, "What for? What did I do wrong, boss?" The customer is beaming self-righteously. Firing is too good for him, thinks the customer. "'Cause it says right here you were moonlighting over at Midas the day you were working here, and you screwed up this guy's brakes. I told you and I told you never to go over there to Midas while you were working here at our franchise." "Oh, please, please don't fire me, Bob. I promise never, ever to sneak over and work for Midas down the street when you're not looking." I put the two invoices side by side on the counter and ask for a signature on our new no-charge bill. Homeboy lets out a sigh as he signs. "What's this here?" he asks. "It's a free oil change next time you come. If your old lady has another car besides this one, she gets a free oil change on her car too. Any time." Well, that's how to get a lifelong customer. Sometimes it works. Heck, sometimes the guy actually goes back to Midas. You never know. There are car name brands that come and go. Some cars are gone forever, and the end of GM marked the end of Saturn, Oldsmobile, Pontiac. Chrysler lost Plymouth, and I remember the old names too, like Hudson Hornet, AMC Pacer, Rambler, LaSalle, Chrysler Imperial, Gremlin, Studebaker's Avanti and Lark, the Gull Wings, Bricklin and DeLorean, Nash, Willys, Marlin, Javelin. There is one whose memory makes me laugh. It was a British Honda that you could buy in Houston for a time. It was called the Sterling. We who worked on cars could recognize that it was somehow connected to Honda, but it was kind of a Honda you'd never seen before. It was sort of like Honda's upgrade, kind of like an Acura, but it was a little bit unrefined. It lasted a few years, then was withdrawn from the market. Perhaps it actually did lose out to the Acura. We had trouble getting parts for them. There were not too many of them out on the street, and the parts suppliers were not going to stock parts until and if the sales became good enough to justify the expense. Ultimately, the foresight of the suppliers was correct. Either that, or they were involved in one of those self-fulfilling prophecies. The car had a Manchester United bumper sticker on the back. Almost 100% of those viewing the sticker had no idea what that even referenced, but I did. We had a limey customer, a Brit, or perhaps just an Anglophile, perhaps some oil company American who had lived in the UK. That explained the Sterling at any rate. The customer had a British accent and said he had something wrong with his silencer. None of the Muffler men who were Billy-Bubbas would know what that meant, but strangely all the Mexican ones did, because the Spanish word for muffler is silenciador. We got his key, and one of my guys drove it to the lift up on the rack. I and the customer, in the meantime, began to fill out the computer stuff. As I was asking him for his name and address and so forth, he offered me an invoice from another one of our franchised shops. As the car rolled in, I was able to hear that the exhaust system was indeed quite loud. I was entering my data into the computer from the old receipt and noticed it had been done just a few weeks ago. As I was doing my work, the customer made mention that mine was not the second, but the third of our company shops that he had taken his car to. Furthermore, he let it be known that he worked for GKN, the parent company that owned our franchise, and was here in the U.S. but would shortly return to the U.K. The customer was apparently unaware that a jury had awarded the franchisees of my company $600 million in damages for theft of franchise advertising fees. It had taken a reverse of technicality and several years of litigation, untold millions in legal fees. And that happened only when they hired the very famous Kenneth Starr.
I knew it sounded a bit too loud, at any rate, a bit louder than the original, so I took it to the second shop.
What did they say? I asked.
They used a welder on it, then told me it was all right. But when I left it, it seemed just as loud. I thought perhaps they had welded up a small seam or leak.
My guy in the shop caught my eye. He held his upraised finger across his lips to make a shush sign, then pointed up under the car. He wanted to show me something, but did not want the customer to see. I carefully did not invite the customer to follow me as I ordinarily would have done, but closed the door behind me as I went out to investigate. The other guy in the shop was also under the car, and he was grinning from ear to ear. I looked up to inspect the work done at the original one of our franchise shops, then fixed by the second. Now the customer had been charged full price, quite a lot, $249.95, quite a lot, but not out of range for a car most guys would have classified as a weird-ass rare bird, thus justifying sticking it a little bit to the customer. Me, I probably would have put a generic muffler on it for $39.95 plus tax and a little labor, all in all perhaps $100 out the door, so I was expecting to see a generic muffler. What I saw was neither generic nor expensive direct fit. It was a Folgers coffee can. The red paint was mostly burned away, but there was enough left I could still make out the name brand and a little red paint. Now some muffler mechanics sign their work. They use the MIG welder to write their initials or some such. You can actually write like this quite easily. It's easier to write than weld actually, so it's not like you're showing off a great skill. Someone had written, "Fuck you, GKN," along the new exhaust pipe. I told my guys quietly, quickly, without making a fuss, to replace everything with a new system, but whatever they did to make sure they saved intact this work they were removing. I told the customer it would take a few minutes and that we were going to redo the whole of it. He wanted to look, of course, but I told him the ding-dong of the doo-dah and our insurance and yada yada yada, and don't look at the bright welder, and in a few minutes we had him on his way, and he actually returned a couple more times to my shop and spent money. I also sent the other shop, the one which had done the original work, an inter-shop bill for my costs. This was one which they had to pay. I would not have used the signed work and coffee can as blackmail had they not paid me, but I sure did keep the can to show everyone. Well, that was a reading of Chapter 15, Customers. And it was from Billy-Bubba's Dumbass Texas Muffler Shop. My name is Pop, and I have several chapters like this on YouTube, plus a whole bunch of other videos, and I invite you to look at those too. And if you enjoyed this, I thank you very much for listening. My name is Pop.